Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Joint Chiefs Chairman Richard Myers were on Capitol Hill today to discuss the Defense Department's budget for the next fiscal year. This hearing's about an hour and 40 minutes.
General Myers, we welcome you back before the subcommittee at this important time for our nation and the Department of Defense, and we welcome the Comptroller, Tina Jonas. The focus of our hearing today is on the fiscal year 2006 defense budget. This is our normally scheduled hearing where we ask the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs to testify near the end of our hearing cycle to provide their important perspectives on the budget. General Myers, I understand this may be your last hearing with us as you plan to retire this year after 40 years of service. We hope we'll see you again, but in any event, we congratulate you and commend you for our service to our nation and your appearances before our committee and for your personal friendship. We've enjoyed that very much. The budget request before us reflects a shift in priorities for the Defense Department, spending more on personnel, the Defense Health Program, Special Operations Forces, Chemical and Biological Defense, and restructuring Army and Marine ground forces, and less on aircrafts and ships designed for conventional war. The committee continues to review this request, and we look forward to this hearing today and the discussion with you of your priorities in the budget regarding investments for the future of our military. We would also welcome any operational updates you may wish to provide. Your full statements will be a part of our committee record. We would ask each member to be limited to 5 minutes in an opening round of questions. Time permitting, we'll proceed to a second round of questioning. I would like to ask our Chairman if he has any remarks. Chairman Cochran, do you wish to make a comment?
Mr. Chairman, no. I just join you in welcoming our distinguished witnesses and commend them for the tremendous leadership that they're providing to our country in this very important time in our history.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Our co-chairman, Senator Noe.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to echo your comments in thanking General Myers for his long service to our nation and for the stellar job he has done. And I can tell you that we sincerely appreciate all you have done for us. Gentlemen, the Defense Department has received unprecedented funding levels during the past few years. Even in inflation-adjusted dollars, the levels surpass anything we have seen since World War II. One would think that with the funding that has been provided, we would not be facing any budgetary issues. Unfortunately, that's not the case. We understand the services are having problems with recruiting and retaining military personnel. We know that some have raised concern about the proposed cuts in the F-22, C-130, and shipbuilding. We recognize that there is a great demand to expand pay and benefits for men and women who serve. So too, there are difficult policy questions on the consideration. So how does the military adapt to improve intelligence capability without violating policies on the conduct of covert activity? Will we require a permanent increase in our forces to meet the challenges that the nation faces today? Is the nation prepared to implement changes in defense policy regarding space control? Does the new conventional global strike concept create challenges for arms control treaties? Today we have more than 150,000 men and women deployed in harm's way in Iraq and Afghanistan. And their willingness to serve and the heroism they have displayed every day is an inspiration to all of us. We know you share our goal to ensure that they are taken care of. Together, it's our responsibility to provide them with the equipment they need to fight, to offer support for their families back home, and to guarantee fair policies which ensure equitable treatment for each service member across all departments. And I'm certain I speak for all when I say we appreciate all that you have done on our behalf. So, Mr. Secretary, General Myers, we are most pleased you could be with us to share with us your views, and I look forward to the testimony. Thank you very much.
May I ask if any member has a problem that must leave before we have a chance to hear the Secretary and General through? Senator Bond?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies to my colleagues, but we are trying to get the long-delayed highway bill to the floor at 11 o'clock, and there is some interest, as I gather from talking to my colleagues, about trying to pass the highway bill, and if it is all right, I would like to make a very brief statement to our distinguished panel, leave some questions, and for the record, because I will not be able to participate.
Each member is going to be recognized for 5 minutes. We recognize you at this time, Senator.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, General Myers, Undersecretary Jonas. We thank you for being here, the great work you do, the positions and responsibilities you hold. Several items that are very important to me and to the people I serve. As founding co-chair of the National Guard Caucus, we don't have to tell you that 50% of the combat force in Iraq and approximately 40% of the entire force is Guard. And anybody who knows the Guard, as I have known from working as their commander-in-chief in Missouri for many years, knows that it comes at a price. Lieutenant General Blum has expressed concern about equipment shortfalls for Guard forces here at home, and I would ask most respectfully that you focus your attention on the readiness needs of the CONUS-based forces. Additionally, I would ask that you review the future total force strategy of the Air Force, which has many Guard leaders and several of my colleagues and me concerned that the future total force may turn into a feudal total force if the Air Guard is not provided a substantive role. I have two letters that I recently received copies of from senior representatives of the National Guard. I will provide those for the record and copies for you, sir. A letter from Major General Radizak, the President of the Adjutants Association, to General Jumper, expressing concerns about the FTF, stating that issues exist that could be very detrimental to the National Guard at the point of irreversible deterioration. In particular, we fear the initiative, as we understand it, will cause serious gaps in a capability to defend the homeland. Second letter from Brigadier General Stephen Coper, President of the National Guard Association, to Congressman on the HASC, says, our membership is expressing grave concern about the direction of the FTF plan and its immediate negative impact on the Air Guard force structure. Concerns include continuation of the air sovereignty mission, funding to transition mission personnel from current missions to future missions, and the limited role adjutants generals have played in developing the FTF plan and its impact on the Air Guard in anticipation of BRAC. Finally, the third major item, I would ask you to look closely at the Air Force decision not to leverage its $68 million investment in the V-3 AESA radar, which upon completion of development within the next year will be the most advanced weapon system in the world for tactical fighters. The V-3 not only increases the expeditionary capability of our air forces, it also makes CONUS-based aircraft the most capable homeland defense platform in the world, second to none. I'm mystified why the Air Force elected not to acquire the system. If this is the Pentagon's idea of a sound business plan, I need to go back to school and take a refresher course on good government. And I would just, the one question I would ask you, Mr. Secretary, have you been briefed on why the Air Force elected to shelve the
Senator, you may submit the questions.
I'll submit that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Secretary, we want to recognize you and General Myers, and then we'll proceed with questions from the committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. 60 years ago, Allied forces fought in some of the fiercest battles of World War II, and the outcome of that difficult struggle certainly helped to transform much of the world, bringing freedom to distant shores, turning dictatorships into democracies, and long-standing enemies into friends. Today, another generation of Americans, along with our coalition allies, have come to freedom's defense, and they're helping millions of liberated people transform their countries from terrorist states into democracies. 2 weeks ago, I met again with coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and with officials of those countries on the front lines of the struggle. Everywhere we traveled, I saw firsthand the point you made, Mr. Chairman, the men and women in uniform, volunteers all, undertaking difficult duties with confidence and with courage, and the debt we owe them is a great one. And members of this committee who have visited with them and the wounded here in the hospitals, I thank you for it. You can't help but come away, as I do, inspired by their courage and their skill. I certainly thank the Congress for providing the resources necessary to support them as they complete their missions. It's becoming increasingly clear that the sacrifices they're making have made a difference in bringing about a world that's freer and more peaceful and that rejects terrorism and extremism. If you think of what's been accomplished in the past 3 years, we have Afghans and Iraqis have held historic elections and selected moderate Muslim leadership. Extremists are under pressure. Americans' national security apparatus is seeing historic changes. NATO's undergoing reforms in organization and missions, deploying forces outside of the NATO treaty area for the first time, outside of Europe. And some 60 nations are engaged freshly in an unprecedented multinational effort to address the proliferation of dangerous weapons. We're here today to discuss the President's fiscal year 2006 request for the Department, as well as funding for the ongoing operations in the global war on terror. Before discussing dollars and programs and weapons, let me just offer some context for the tasks ahead. When the President Bush took office 4 years ago, he recognized the need to transform our defense establishment to meet the unconventional and somewhat unpredictable threats of the 21st century. The attacks on September 11th gave urgency and impetus to the efforts then underway to make the armed forces more agile, more expeditionary, and more lethal. The national security apparatus of the United States has undergone and continues to undergo historic changes on a number of fronts. We are addressing the urgency of moving military forces rapidly across the globe, the necessity of functioning as a truly joint force, the need to recognize that we're engaged in a war and yet still bound by peacetime behavior and practices and constraints and regulations and requirements. But we're up against an enemy that is unconstrained by laws or bureaucracies. We're adjusting to a world where the threat is not from a single superpower as it was that we could become quite familiar with over a sustained period of time, but rather from various regimes and extremist cells that can work together and proliferate lethal capabilities. After more than 3 years of conflict, two central realities of this struggle are clear. First is that the struggle won't be won by military means alone. That's clear. Second is the reality that this new era, the United States cannot win the global struggle alone. No one nation can. It will take cooperation among a great many countries to stop weapons proliferation, for example. It takes nations working together to locate and dismantle extremist cells and to stop future attacks. One thing we've learned since September 11th and in operations in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere is that in most cases, the capacities of our partners and our allies can be critical to the success of our own military forces, as is the ability and proclivity of our partners to curb the spread and appeal of that poisonous ideology in their education systems, news media, religious and political institutions. Mr. Chairman, for all the progress that's been made, and it is substantial, the armed forces are still largely equipped, understandably, to confront conventional armies, navies, and air forces. We've made major commitments to modernize and expand the Army, adding some $35 billion over the next 7 years, in addition to the $13 billion the Army has in the baseline budget. We're increasing deployable combat power from 33 active duty brigades to 43 more powerful modular brigade combat teams. These teams are designed to be able to deploy quickly abroad, but will have firepower, armor, and logistics support to be sustained over a period of time. In addition to increasing overall combat capability, the Army's modularity initiative, plus an increase of 30,000 troops in the size of the operational Army, is to reduce stress on the force by increasing by 50% the amount of time that active duty soldiers will be able to spend at home between overseas deployments. And as a result of a series of reforms, we're making the reserve components, those individual reservists and guardsmen in high-demand specialties, will be, in the future, be deployed less often, for shorter periods of time, and with more notice and predictability for themselves and for their families. The Department continues to reevaluate our contingency plans, our operations, force structure, in light of the technological advances of the past decades. These advances, plus improved force organization and deployment, have allowed the Department to generate considerably more combat capability with the same, or in some cases, fewer numbers of weapon platforms. For example, in Operation Desert Storm, one aircraft carrier could engage about 175 targets per day. During Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2004, one aircraft carrier, instead of engaging 175 targets per day, could engage 650 targets per day, more than a threefold increase. Today, one B-2 bomber can be configured to attack as many as 80 different targets with 80 precision weapons during one sortie. In the past, the Navy maintained a rigid deployment schedule. Ships would deploy for 6 months, overlapping with the ships they relieved, and upon arriving home, they would become relatively useless. Training and equipment readiness plummeted into what became known in the Navy as the bathtub, with many battle groups unavailable for missions. The Navy's new Fleet Response Plan has the capability to surge 5 or 6 carrier strike groups in 30 days, with the ability to deploy an additional 2 in 90 days. In consultation with Congress and our allies, the Department is making some long overdue changes in global basing. We're moving away from the Cold War garrisons towards an ability to surge quickly to wherever capability is needed. When the President took office, the Cold War had been over for a decade, but the U.S. forces overseas continue to be stationed as if we expected a Soviet tank attack in Germany, and as though South Korea was still an impoverished country devastated by the Korean War. We advanced the common sense notion that U.S. troops should be where they're needed, they should be where they're wanted, a hospitable environment, and they should be where they can be used effectively in the 21st century. Those changes are bringing home some 70,000 troops and up to 100,000 family members. Military personnel and their families, as a result, will experience fewer changes of station, less disruption in their lives, which of course is an important factor in reducing stress on the force. The new global security environment drives the approach to our domestic force posture as well. Some thoughts about the future. To the seeming surprise of some, our enemies have brains. They are constantly adapting and adjusting to what we're doing. They combine medieval sensibilities with modern technology and with media savvy to find new ways to exploit perceived weaknesses and to weaken the civilized world. We have to employ the lessons of the past 3.5 years of war to be able to anticipate, adjust, and act and react with greater agility. These necessary reforms have encountered and will continue to encounter resistance. It's always difficult to depart from the known and the comfortable. Abraham Lincoln once compared his efforts to reorganize the Union Army during the Civil War to bailing out the Potomac River with a teaspoon. We're finding it tough, but it's not going to be that tough. If you consider the challenge our country faces to not only reorganize the military, but also to try to transform an enormous defense bureaucracy and to fight 2 wars at the same time. And if that were not enough, we're doing all of this for the first time in history in an era with 24-hour worldwide satellite news coverage, live coverage of terrorist attacks, cell phones, digital cameras, global internet, email, embedded reporters, an increasingly casual regard for protection of classified documents and information, and a United States government that is essentially still organized for the industrial age as opposed to the information age. Mr. Chairman, the President's 2006 budget request proposes some tough choices, and it proposes to fund a balanced combination of programs to develop and field the capabilities most needed by the American military. It continues to use Navy and Marine Corps shift towards a new generation of ships and related capabilities. It continues the acquisition of Air Force, Navy, and other aircraft to sustain U.S. air dominance and provide strong airlift and logistics support. It continues to strengthen U.S. missile defenses. It advances new intelligence and communication capabilities with many times the capacity of existing systems. The budget would maintain the President's commitment to our military men and women and their families as well. It includes a 3.1% increase in military base pay. The budget keeps us on track to eliminate all inadequate military family housing units in the next 3 years. As to the current budget process, I appreciate your efforts to move the President's supplemental request quickly. It's critical that the military services receive these funds soon. I know that the members of Congress understand that. The Army's basic readiness and operating accounts will be exhausted in early May. Now it's just a matter of days, and it's already taken to stretching existing funds to make up the shortfalls. So I urge the Congress to achieve final passage of the supplemental before the recess later this week. Afghan and Iraqi security forces. Transferring resources away from the training and equipping of Iraqi and Afghan security forces, of course, would seriously impede their ability to assume responsibilities that are now borne by U.S. troops. And I would add, at vastly greater cost to our country in both dollars and lives. We need the flexibility to channel this funding to where it's needed most. The House's reductions in funding for sustaining other coalition forces, as well as the underfunding of the President's request to reimburse cooperating nations, would make it vastly more difficult for allies and partners to support military and stability operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, further increasing the strain on U.S. forces. Failure to fund projects that Central Command requested could impede our ability to support ongoing operations in the theater with respect to military construction. We believe that a restriction on acquisition of the DDX destroyer would drive up costs and would restrict options while the Navy and the Department conduct a detailed evaluation of the program. The pending Senate restrictions on the USS John F. Kennedy would prevent the Navy from freeing up resources to counter current threats while preparing for future challenges. Finally, underfunding known costs, such as higher fuel expenditures or including new unfunded death and injury benefits in the final bill, will of necessity force us to divert resources from other troop needs. So I respectfully ask this committee to take these considerations into account. Mr. Chairman, across the world, brave men and women wearing America's uniform are doing the truly hard work of history. I know you share my desire to see that they have all the support they need. Bringing the hope of freedom to some of the darkest corners of the earth will render a powerful blow to the forces of extremism who have killed thousands of innocent people in our country and across the globe. I thank you all for what you have done on behalf of our troops, and we look forward to responding to questions. Thank you, sir.
General Myers, you have a statement, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Inouye and members of the committee. Once again, thank you for your unwavering support of our armed forces, and more specifically, the men and women in uniform, particularly as they fight this all-important global war on terrorism and violent extremism. We remember the brave servicemen and women and government civilians who have been wounded or given their lives for this noble cause, and we grieve with their friends and with their families. We are now in the 4th year of sustained combat operations, and our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and U.S. government civilians continue to perform superbly under extremely challenging conditions. I am tremendously proud of them, as I know you are. Our forces are fully prepared to support our national defense strategy and to assure our allies while we dissuade, deter, and defeat any adversary. The fiscal year 06 defense budget request provides critical funding for winning the global war on terrorism, securing peace in Iraq and Afghanistan, combating weapons of mass destruction, enhancing our joint warfighting capabilities, and transforming the armed forces to meet the challenges of the 21st century. Our forces are the world's most capable, in large part because they are the best trained and equipped. The 2006 defense budget and the funds you supported in the fiscal year 05 supplemental request are vital to ensuring our troops are trained and resourced for the missions they're assigned and to sustain their readiness while they're deployed. In my opinion, this is a pivotal moment in our nation's history and in world history. We must stay committed in this global war on terrorism and violent extremism if justice, tolerance, and freedom are to triumph over violence, fear, and repression. And make no mistake, we have undertaken a long and a hard task to help people long brutalized by repressive regimes build a future based on freedom and tolerance. Our significant progress in Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the world is a tribute to the hard work and sacrifice of our dedicated American service members and our coalition partners, and to the continuing dedication of the American people and the Congress. In Iraq, the U.S. remains committed to helping the Iraqis build a secure and peaceful future with a representative government based upon the rule of law. Over the last year, the Iraqi people have become more and more self-reliant. The transfer of sovereignty last June, the successful election, followed by the Transitional National Assembly selection of the Presidency Council and the Prime Minister, showed their courage and determination to support a free and democratic country, and also to continue to represent a moral defeat for the insurgents. Despite the many challenges, the Iraqis have shown a strong pride of ownership in their new government and in their future. Forming a new government is not easy, but continued progress is essential to sustaining the positive momentum seen since the January elections. In Afghanistan, the coalition continues to make great progress. Congress's firm commitment is leading the international effort to fund and equip Afghan reconstruction. NATO and the coalition will continue to help build and train the commands and institutions the Afghans need to sustain and manage their security apparatus. One of the greatest challenges in Afghanistan is the illegal drug trade. The Afghan government and the international community must continue to combat these challenges. Of all these operations, at home and overseas, they all come at a cost, especially for our people, both our active and reserve component. They are so tremendously dedicated. They understand their mission very, very well, and they understand what a huge difference they're making, and the morale is good. In the face of continued demands on our forces, we are analyzing all our policies and making changes to mitigate readiness challenges. I am concerned with the wear and tear on our equipment, and I thank this committee for its continued support of our request to help repair and replace our rapidly aging resources. Congressional support, both in the annual budget and supplemental funding, has been exceptional and essential for funding our continued operations and for funding Army modularization, recapitalization, and transformation. And I'm proud of our transformational efforts and successes, and we must continue to invest heavily in transformation, both intellectually and materially, so we can meet the challenges facing our country today and in the future. This year, we're working through three major processes that will have a far-reaching impact on the future force posture. The first, of course, is the 2005 Quadrennial Defense Review, and it will provide a comprehensive strategic plan for transforming the armed forces. Second, the base realignment and closure process provides an excellent opportunity to further transform our warfighting capability and eliminate excess capacity. And third, our global basing strategy transforms the Cold War footprint into one that's focused on combining the capabilities of U.S.-based rotational forces that are lean and agile with strategically placed overseas-based forces. The important transformational decisions we make today will have a lasting impact on our nation's defense capabilities and the capabilities of our allies and coalition partners. As I know all of you know, we must stay committed if we are to win this global war on terrorism and extremism and defend the United States and our national interest. As the Secretary said, the U.S. military can't do this alone. Success in this 21st century security environment requires cooperating with our multinational partners and integrating military capabilities across the U.S. interagency. In my view, our way of life remains at stake, so failure is not an option. And with Congress's continued strong support, our military will continue to be unwavering in our focus, our resolve, and our dedication to peace and freedom. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee, and we look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. We'll have a period now of 5 minutes apiece on our members here. I'm informed that most members of the committee, subcommittee are going to attend, so we've limited the 5 minutes. Let me recognize the chairman of the full committee first.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. There's been some concern expressed about the fact that those who serve in reserve components of the armed forces, when they are coming back to a civilian status, are in some cases losing the opportunity to work in the jobs they had before they were deployed and went on active duty. To what extent is the department undertaking to try to deal with that situation and help make it possible for reservists and guardsmen to serve our country in this time of need, and at the same time be treated fairly by the private sector when they return?
Senator, first of all, I would say that the employers of America have been terrific in general across the country. I'm sure there are always situations where that's not the case, but they have done a great many things to be supportive of members of the Guard and Reserve during the periods that they've been activated and when they return. As you know, reservist jobs are protected by law under the Uniformed Services Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. We have an organization within the Department of Defense that works directly with employers when a reemployment problem arises, and there's a National Committee for Employer Support of the Guard and Reserve that exists and functions. They contact employers and attempt to work out problems with informal means. If that fails, then there are a formal complaint process that can go forward in the Department of Labor, which has the responsibility for investigating and resolving any complaints under that statute. So I would say that I have heard of relatively few instances of problems, and I hope that that's a reflection of the actual situation.
We're working with our colleagues over on the House side to resolve differences on a supplemental appropriations bill that provides substantial funding for military operations in the global war on terror, and particularly with respect to our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. We hope to complete action on that conference committee work this week, as you suggested in your opening statement. But what difficulty would the department encounter if we're not able to do that as we hope we can? Give me something I can pass on to the members of the conference committee as we meet today to try to light a fire under the process.
Well, we checked with the services, and the Army estimates that, I guess this is what, the 27th of April, they estimate that around May 5th, some of the commands may have to stop hiring and stop ordering supplies and stop awarding contracts until they have the House-Senate conference has completed their work and the supplemental been dealt with by the President. The Army has already started slowing some obligations to try to make funds last so that they would not have to do that. And of course, once you start swinging funds around from one activity to another, frequently it requires reprogramming, it requires inefficiencies that are unfortunate that then have to be made up later.
One of the concerns in some of our states is where we have industrial activities relating to shipbuilding or airplane manufacturing, other activities that provide armaments and equipment to the military forces, that in some cases there's substantial cutbacks in projected spending, so that the budgets that had been anticipated for building ships and some of these other activities are not what they're not what they were expected to be, putting a lot of pressure on the ability of employers to predict how many people they need to continue working at the shipyards and in other plants. Do you expect that there would be any change in the request that we're beginning to hear, cutting back the number of ships that we need in the future or other armaments? How do you expect we're going to be able to maintain the efficiency in these industrial capabilities in the face of these unexpected cutbacks?
Senator, the Navy has done a great deal of study on the shipbuilding, to take that specifically. And they now have some suggestions that are being considered by the Department of Defense and by the Congress, obviously. My anticipation is that they will have clarity and conviction in an appropriate time. The Quadrennial Defense Review also is something that's underway, and that enters into this discussion. But one of the important things I would say is that if we look only at numbers of ships, it seems to me that we miss something terribly important. The fact is that when we had a fleet of 485 ships, we routinely were able to deploy 102 ships out of 485, and that's because of the way the fleet was managed. Large numbers were constantly under repair, the crews were on leave, the whole process was arranged that way. Today the fleet size is plus or minus 285 ships. It's low. On the other hand, we're routinely deploying 95 ships out of 285, compared to 102 ships out of 485. So what's really important is, what are you able to use? What's the usability of the fleet, not the total number? And clearly, the usability is about the same. And then the second question is the one I mentioned in my opening remarks, which was, what can that ship do, or what can that carrier battle group do? And it can do 3 or 4 times as much as carriers and capabilities 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think we need to look at capability. I don't deny that presence is important, but the deployability affects the presence issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chair recognizes our ranking member, Senator Byrd, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, General. One of my constituents, Mrs. Lisa Vance of Morgantown, West Virginia, contacted my office last week. She is the widow of a West Virginia National Guardsman killed in Afghanistan in May of 2002. She relays her story of the incredible burdens that she has had to face after her tragic loss. Mrs. Vance has gone through more trouble than any military widow ought to have to bear. Mrs. Vance reported that paperwork errors nearly cost her $50,000 in life insurance funds. She has never received the financial counseling to which she is entitled. She received no explanation of the health insurance benefits that she was eligible for immediately after her husband's death. A simple pay issue took 3 years to resolve. Some of the guidance Mrs. Vance received on important matters was based on Army field manuals that were more than 10 years out of date. At one point, her casualty assistance officer retired. No replacement ever arrived to assist her. The bottom line is that the casualty assistance officers who assist widows do not appear to have adequate training for the incredibly difficult job that they must perform. I don't question the dedication or commitment of the soldiers who must perform this job. There are questions about whether the military is giving these officers sufficient training to assist grieving widows in their hour of greatest need. General Myers, how much training is given to casualty assistance officers before they're sent out to care for grieving families?
You know, Senator Byrd, that's an issue that we follow very, very closely. My suspicion is this is a unit-specific problem where the training either wasn't done properly or, for whatever reason, the proper leadership wasn't provided. I don't think this is a problem that's systemic, and I'll get you the facts for exactly how much assistance, but this From the information that I get, this is obviously an isolated case, and it's a very bad case, and nobody should have to go through that.
Thank you. Do members of the National Guard receive the same training as their active duty counterparts?
They should, absolutely.
Are there adequate numbers of chaplains in the armed forces to offer comfort to war widows?
I'd say for the most part there are, although there is and has been for some time a lack of adequate Catholic priest in the armed forces chaplaincy, as there are a lack of priests in the civilian community, and that's been a continuing problem. But I think in other denominations that is not a problem.
General Myers, do you feel that there's a need to increase the number of chaplains to compensate for the strain of overseas deployments? And is there a need for more funding to provide more chaplains for the armed services?
It's not been brought to my attention that that's a shortfall that needs to be addressed, so I can't answer that question.
Have there been any changes to the training for casualty assistance officers based upon the experiences of war widows like Mrs. Vance?
You bet, because the benefits have changed over time, and so that's a program that is continually updated by the services who are responsible for that.
How can Congress be assured that the widows of troops who were killed in Iraq in recent days will not have the same problems that Mrs. Vance encountered?
Well, it's something we've addressed from the day that we started this war on terrorism and against violent extremism, and in an effort to try to do that, to help if everything else fails. We have an operation called Military One Source that's been set up here, actually I think in Virginia. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to provide the kind of assistance that you just mentioned. So if they're not getting the help, if people aren't getting the help they need on any question, they have a toll-free telephone number, internet, and email access, and will refer the questions to the appropriate authorities and follow up to make sure it gets done. So, and as you know, also early on, we had some questions about the reserve component's ability to provide the kind of information, not just on casualties, but basic information to the families. This is because in reserve component case, many of the families are not co-located on a base or a camp or a station or a post. And the reserve component has really stood up to that requirement and provides excellent, I think, information to the families and the employers, for that matter, of those that are deployed.
Thank you, General Myers. Secretary Rumsfeld, are you satisfied with the services and counseling provided to war widows?
Senator Byrd, anytime one hears a story that you cited about Mrs. Vance, obviously you can't be satisfied. The points that General Myers made, there are a variety of ways to try to assist people in the event that there's a breakdown in the system. There's frequently breakdowns in any system, as we all know. One other thing that exists today is a organization called americasupportsyou.mil, where you can go on the internet and you can find out ways that citizens in communities are helping people who may have difficulties. And it is a terrific website, because it shows all the things that are being done around the country to assist people who are connected with the military and to support them as well as to support the troops.
Mr. Secretary, what are the areas that need improvement, and what is being done about it?
Well, the things that have been done, there's, in addition to what General Myers has cited here, this family support activity, there is, for the severely injured, there is a separate activity that is designed to assist people who come back with severe injuries of any type, and to assist them and their families in that period after they begin to become disconnected from the military, in the event that they do disconnect from the military. Although I must say, there are an increasing number of severely injured people who are staying in the military and being able to continue to serve.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Senator.
Mr. Chairman.
We'll come back later, Senator Byrd. Senator Feinstein, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And General, let me thank you very much for your service to our country. I know the days have been tough and long, and I just want you to know that
Press the button.
I'd like to ask ask two questions on procurement having to do with the F-22 and the C-130. If I understand the President's budget correctly, it's going to complete the procurement program for the F-22 with the production of 179 planes instead of the 750. It will end the program in '08 instead of 11. Are you effectively then truncating this program and completing it by '08?
Senator, I would describe it slightly differently. Last year's planned purchase of FNA 22s was 277, and that has been brought down to 170 aircraft through 2008. And it was done with the statement that during the quadrennial defense review, the issue of the number of wings of, this is a very fine aircraft, and from everything I can tell, it is still in process, however, and it is very expensive. And as a result, the quadrennial defense review is designed to, in this case, determine the number of wings, whether a single wing or 1.5 wings or 2 wings might be appropriate. And until that work is done, we'll not know what number between 170 and something like 277 might be appropriate. And I think that as we come out of the QDR, where we're looking at other capabilities that relate to air dominance, we ought to have a better idea of what portion of the air dominance role would be played by an FNA 22 from a cost-benefit standpoint.
So it's 170 by 2008. Are you figuring the additional aircraft at $250 million per?
The last number I heard was about $250 million. 257 million is the latest rounded number.
Now, let me ask you about, if I can, the C-130J. You end procurement in 2006. You're going to be 100 short of the original purchase. It's a $350 billion saving, but $1 billion is just in cancellation of the contract. Is that true?
I'm not certain of that number. I know there's been a good deal of debate about what the cancellation of a termination of a multi-year contract would cost, and the issue is open. We've said that there's some additional information that's become available subsequent to putting the President's budget to bed, and at some point in the weeks ahead, we'll have better information. To the extent it suggests that any adjustments ought to be made, and what we propose, obviously, we would come back to the Congress with those proposals.
Appreciate that. Now, very smart, Mr. Secretary. You have apparently divided the money for the robust nuclear earth penetrator between the energy budget and the defense budget, with $4.5 million in one and $4 million in the other. As you know, the energy budget, the monies were deleted last year, so this year you've divided it. In March, the Secretary of Energy was asked on the House side about how deep he thought the bunker buster could go, and he said a couple of tens of meters maybe. And he was asked if there's any way to have a bomb that penetrated far enough to trap all fallout. And he said, I don't believe that. I don't believe the laws of physics will ever permit that. I asked him that same question when the Energy Appropriations Committee met just a few weeks ago. He said essentially the same thing. It is beyond me as to why you're proceeding with this program when the laws of physics won't allow a missile to be driven deeply enough to retain the fallout, which will spew in hundreds of millions of cubic feet if it's at 100 kilotons. So I am mystified by the fact the money was deleted last year, but you're back this year and you split it into two budgets.
Senator Feinstein, you make a mistake by saying I'm very smart by splitting it in. I had no idea.
Well, I figure you have a better chance in this committee
just-
than you do in energy.
Maybe just lucky rather than smart. Let me just take a minute on the subject. It's an interesting subject. There are some 70 countries that are currently pursuing underground programs. Today, dual-use equipment that's available anywhere in the world to anybody who wants it can dig in one day a distance in solid rock longer than a basketball court and twice as high as the basket. One machine, one day, underground in solid rock. 70 countries are pursuing activities underground. So the question comes, what ought our country to do about that? Or do we want to think about, study the idea of having a capability of dealing with that? At the present time, we don't have a capability of dealing with that. We can't go in there and get at things in solid rock underground. The proposal is the only thing we have is very large, very dirty, big nuclear weapons. So the choice isn't do we want to have nothing and only a large, dirty nuclear weapon, or would we rather have something in between? That is the issue. It isn't the way your question characterized it, in my view. Now, are we proposing a specific weapon? No. We are proposing a study. We are proposing that some work be done, analysis, not nuclear explosion work, but a study to see if we're capable of developing or designing something that would give us the ability to penetrate, and not with a large nuclear explosion, but penetrate either with a conventional capability or with a very small nuclear capability in the event that the United States of America, some point down the road, decided they wanted to undertake that kind of a project. It seems to me studying it makes all the sense in the world. General, do you want to comment on it?
That was the point. I'd make the exact same point. The choice is between, we have targets today that we have weapons assigned against, underground targets, which the only capability you have is a big weapon. And what we're looking at, what we propose in the study, is can some of the smaller weapons can the case be hardened enough to get enough penetration to have some impact against against these targets without going to the option that nobody likes, which is a more robust, bigger weapon. And that's the issue. And the issue also is it's a study. It's not and it's not to design a new weapon.
Chair, I just appreciate a clarification. Are you saying that the 100 kiloton bomb is out, that you are not looking at the development of a 100 kiloton bomb, but it's a low-yield bomb?
My understanding is that that they're not talking about making any weapon. They're talking about a study that relates particularly to penetration.
And they're looking at specific weapons that are in the inventory, and can the case be made hard enough on those particular weapons to get the kind of penetration they think will be effective against these deeply buried and hardened targets.
Senator Spector is
time is up.
recognized for
Thank
5
you.
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for your service. Beginning with the base closure issues, Pennsylvania has been very hard hit in the past, characterized by the closing of the Philadelphia Navy Yard, for which we still haven't recovered in our state, as there was a proliferation of contracts which went out from that installation. And I'm going to be submitting to you questions for the record. And I don't want to ask a question now to take up the time. I want to move on. But I do hope that consideration will be given to the historic import of the bases in Pennsylvania, which, of course, has been around for a long time as a state. And illustrative of that is the War College, where there's enormous pride in the community, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where it is located. And when the president
That's been my understanding.
decided where he wanted to go, he went to the War College with great pomp and ceremony, made quite a point that only two Georges, as sitting presidents, marched into Carlisle. One was George Washington on a great stallion, a great portrait, and the other was President Bush. So I would just hope that real consideration would be given to the tradition and the economic factors where people are biting their nails in Pennsylvania as to what's going to happen next after we've had so many closures. This afternoon, a conference committee will be sitting on the $81 billion request by the Department of Defense. And it has been broadly supported. We are appreciative of what you're doing, Mr. Secretary, and what you're doing, General, and what the troops are doing, and we're going to back you. But there's a lot of disquiet out there among the people as to what is happening in Iraq, and disquiet as to what is happening to our discretionary budget. I chair a subcommittee which is responsible for education and health care and worker safety, and it's been cut by almost a full percent, and with the inflation factor, I'm about $7 billion short. And that makes it very, very tough to sell when you have NIH and healthcare programs and Pell Grants and education. The question that I have for you, Mr. Secretary, comes up on the RAND report. And it was summarized in the Washington Post, and it was highly critical. And as is known, this is a report, at least according to the Post, that was prepared for you, and that you thought their comments were worthy of careful consideration as reported in the Post. We had the situation with General Shinseki some time ago, who had made a prediction about the number of troops which would be necessary to handle post-Iraq problems, and I won't characterize the response to General Shinseki, but it was not one of approbation as to what happened. But the RAND study, and I won't quote it extensively, criticizes DOD for a lack of political military coordination and actionable intelligence in dealing with counterinsurgency campaign, and well, it's just highly critical. And I have a three-part question for you, Mr. Secretary. Was General Shinseki right on number one? Number two, is the RAND report right? And number three, what has been or will be done to meet the questions raised by the RAND report?
Well, I'll start, and General Myers may want to comment on it, but I think that the first thing I would say about the troop strength that General Shinseki was asked about in a congressional committee, and his response was that he thought it would take, as I recall, and I'm going to paraphrase, I don't have it in front of me, but his response after being asked 2 or 3 times was that he thought it might take roughly the same number of troops to deal with the country after major combat operation as it would take to prevail in the conflict. And I believe he then said several 100,000. It turned out that General Franks had several 100,000 ready to go in. And he also had a plan that if he decided he didn't need them, he would have excursions, escape plans, so that they wouldn't go in. We would put in what he believed to be the right number. General Franks, General Abizaid, General Myers, General Pace proposed the correct number of troops. And they proposed a number of troops. That is the number we went with. That is the number we have in there today. It is perfectly possible for anyone, in or out of government, to critique that and say, gee, I think there ought to be more or there ought to be less. But the fact of the matter is that the military experts on the ground from the beginning have said what they thought the number ought to be, and the tension that they have balanced is this. The more troops you have, the more targets you have, and the more people you might get killed. The more troops you have, the more of an occupying power you are, the heavier footprint, the more force protection you need, the more logistics you need, and the more intrusive you are on the people of that country. Now, the Soviets had 300,000 people in Afghanistan, and they lost. And we had 20 or 30,000 people in Afghanistan, and it's coming out pretty darn well. So I must say I am tired of the Shinseki argument being bantied about day after day in the press.
It wasn't an argument, it was a question.
Well, I understand that, but the fact is that we have done what the generals on the ground believe to be the right thing, and I believe they're right. And I think that the progress that was made in Afghanistan demonstrates that, and I think the progress being made in Iraq demonstrates that. And when the president went around the room and asked if all the chiefs, well, I'll let you describe it, General. You were there.
Well, of course, before major combat in Iraq, the commander-in-chief had all his service chiefs, and matter of fact, at a separate session, all of General Franks' commanders and General Franks, and asked if anybody had any reservations, if they had everything we needed, and if we're ready to go. And everybody gave a thumbs up on that. So that's how that process worked. I would say on General...
And General Shinseki was there in the room.
Certainly, I don't think
And
anybody
he
argued.
was silent? Was General Shinseki silent in the face of that question put to him, or in a room where he was
I
present?
can't remember. He certainly didn't bring up a couple 100,000. We were all all the service chiefs were in total support of General Franks' plan, the numbers that we had planned, all of that. Yes, we were all on board. There was nobody, there were no outliers. On the other hand, just one more time, General Shinseki was in front of a Senate committee, was asked a question, and he said several times, that's really not my business. Would need to talk to the combatant commander, and I haven't done that. And when pressed, offered a number. He's an experienced, very experienced Army officer. He had a lot of experience in the Balkans, and he gave them a number based on his experience and so forth. I don't think he would ever say that he was prepared to go to the bank with that number. He was providing the number when asked several times, and it's his right to give that number. And we had lots of discussions later on about, what is the right number, and is the force strength appropriate for the task and the mission that we had inside Iraq. And in the end, we all agreed that the plan, and by the way, the plan was developed over some time in a very iterative fashion between the Commander-in-Chief, the Secretary of Defense, and the military leadership, and evolved over time. I mean, it changed dramatically from the first time we ever got together, General Franks, on this issue, which was before any thought of going into Iraq was actually on the table, until we finally went in. So it was a long process. I would only comment on the RAND report. I'm aware of it. I have not read it. I read the executive summary. It's in the Joint Staff. In my case, it's in the Joint Staff, and we're looking at each of those pieces. One of the things that has characterized this effort, both in in the last 3.5 years, different from previous, I think, is that we have really paid attention to trying to capture what we've done right and what we've done wrong. The lessons learned process, Senator Specter. It's very aggressive, and when I say aggressive, we have people in Iraq today, but we've had them since major combat, that have been participating with the forces there, helping them, but also capturing lessons learned for Joint Forces Command to compile so we can then take actions. And we have, I think, a very good process on how we capture those and then try to internalize them, put the resources to them, and solve the problems. That's what we're all about. And the RAND report will help in that regard, and I don't have specific comments on it today.
And there isn't a month that goes by that we don't look at troop levels in Iraq and troop levels in Afghanistan and ask people what's the right number, what's the best way to use them, what are the advantages and disadvantages of more or less. It is a constant process for us.
I congratulate you and ask you 3 questions at one time and carrying us over an extra 5 minutes, as a matter of fact.
I didn't have an extra 5 minutes. They did, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Noyes recognized.
Mr. Secretary, we are relying heavily on our National Guard and the reserves, so much so that some are suggesting that the reserve component is already broken. Furthermore, it's becoming much more difficult to recruit and retain our ground forces. And for the first time in many years, the Army and Marine Corps are not meeting their recruiting targets. And there are some who are already discussing the draft. In your view, what is the current status of our military personnel, including end strength, recruiting, retention numbers?
Senator, the Generally, retention has been fine. It's in the services. With respect to recruiting, there has not been a problem of recruiting in the Air Force or the Navy. The Army and the Marines have missed their targets by relatively small amounts. A couple of reasons for that. One is the targets are up. We're increasing the size of the Army and we're increasing the size of the Marines. A second reason is because retention of people who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan is high. They are the normal people that would be recruited into the Guard and Reserve, and instead many of them are being retained because our troop levels are higher. So we're not surprised that that exists. And as a result, we've had to deploy additional recruiters and provide additional incentives. And there's some debate within the experts who do this as to whether or not they'll meet their goals by the end of the year, the fiscal year. I don't know if they will or not for the Army or the Marines in terms of recruiting, but it certainly looks like they will in retention. And they're taking all the appropriate steps to get there. Second, generally, what's the state of the Guard and Reserve? I think the idea that they're broken is not correct. I think they're performing fabulous service overseas. They are getting experience that hasn't existed since the Vietnam War, and these individuals have additional training and additional experience and additional capability. I think the only people who could conceivably be talking about a draft are people who are speaking from pinnacles of near perfect ignorance. The last thing we need is a draft. We just don't. We've got a volunteer Army and Navy and Marines and Air Force, and they're doing a fabulous job. And all we have to do is see that we provide the right incentives to attract and retain the people we need, and we'll continue to have a superb total force.
If I may, just tag on a little bit. Let me talk about retention for just a minute. As the Secretary said, retention is exceeding all goals. It's particularly high in the reserve component units that have been mobilized and deployed. It's particularly high in the reserve component units that have been mobilized and deployed. That tells you something right there. It tells you that these folks are proud to serve, they understand the mission, they're willing to serve, and that's that retention both in the active component and particularly in the active component where it's high as well, that hurts our recruiting for the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve. It continues to be a problem because they rely on those folks that are getting out of the Army to come on to reserve duty at a time when the active Army is building up to 30,000 additional end strength. So the recruiting goal this year is huge. I think it's 80,000 or in that realm. The Marine Corps has missed its recruiting goals in January, February, and March, but the numbers, particularly in March, are very small. We'll have to see what additional recruiters, what additional incentives do to correct that. I hope it turns around. I hope the moms and dads and the aunts and uncles and the grandparents in this country understand that this is a nation at war, that the stakes are extremely high. Just transport yourself back to the days and weeks following September 11th, 2001, and reflect on the uncertainty that was in all our minds. And another event like that would have serious consequences for this country, of course, and it would put at stake our way of life. And so this is noble business that our servicemen and women are doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, Djibouti, around the world. And we need encouragement from the moms and dads and the aunts and uncles and the rest of the folks out there to encourage the young men and women of this country to sign up for this noble cause, which I think will have a huge impact on the outcome of our future and our way of life.
If I could just add, Senator, there is stress on the force. However, we've only activated out of the Guard and Reserve about 40%. The problem is not that we've got too few. The problem is that we're so badly organized and have been for decades. We have the wrong skill sets on active duty relative to the Guard and Reserve. We need to get some of those skill sets out of the Guard and Reserve onto active duty so we don't have to overuse a small fraction of the Guard and Reserve. We also have to rebalance within the active force and the Guard and Reserve so that we have the best skill sets, more of the skill sets that are more likely to be needed. And that's just something that's going forward. We're already doing a great deal of that. Pete Schoonmaker and Fran Harvey have done a lot to do that, and it's been very helpful. One other thing we're doing, thanks to the National Security Personnel System, is we're going to be able to do a better job of getting military people out of civilian jobs. There may be 200, 300,000 military people out of 1.4 million active duty that are doing jobs that can be done by civilians or contractors. So there are plenty of ways to reduce stress on the force just by good management practices, which we're hard at.
Thank you very much, sir.
Mr. Secretary, I think you've commented that there's been additional information received about the C-130J since the President's budget was submitted. I'm not asking a question, but I just encourage you to give us a supplemental if you possibly can, because clearly that amendment is going to come on the floor. If it's not covered by the budget, we're going to run into problems as far as taking something out to make room for that C-130J amount.
I see.
Let me ask you this. According to the plans we've seen, Department of Defense procurement accounts will grow about 50% from $78 billion to $118 billion from this fiscal year to the 2011 timeframe. Even with such growth, it looks like the department's ability to field many new systems that are in development or initial development, initial procurement, F-22 Joint Strike Fighter, DDX, the Littoral Combat Ship, Army Future Combat System, space satellites, a whole series of things, to name them. What is going to be the ability to continue on those systems with that type of projection of the procurement accounts?
Well, that's a question, Senator, Mr. Chairman, that we all wrestle with. It's been one that's been around as long as I've been connected with the Defense Department, is the so-called bow wave problem. And what happens is that a lot of things get started, and that one then looks out and says, well, once you start into development, as opposed to research and the early stages, the costs go up. And the second... Therefore, you have to manage that so that you have an ability to cope with whatever needs to be procured in those out years. But for a variety of reasons, some things disappear, some things don't work, sometimes needs change and tough choices get made. We made tough choices in this budget. 4 years ago, we made tough budget choices when we looked at the bow wave problem. And you're quite right. I see a bow wave looming now, procurement bow wave looming. But on the other hand, I have a feeling that it'll be like every other time. When the going gets tough, people make tough decisions, and that's the way it has to be.
Well, in the general economy, the progression is such that the next generation of technology is usually less costly and more efficient than its predecessor. In terms of defense procurement, it seems that we continue to grow in terms of cost, notwithstanding the differences in size, et cetera. Is anyone examining into that? Why can't we get more technology development that's related to cost?
A couple of thoughts. Time is money, and you're quite right. 25 years ago, when I was Secretary of Defense, the length of time to acquire a weapon system was about half of what it is today. And this is during a period in the last 25, 30 years where technology has sped up. It's accelerated rather than decelerated. So something's wrong with the system. We're going to have a very serious look at the acquisition process in the quadrennial defense review period. And Gordon England, who's just shortly, I believe, will be confirmed by the Senate and sworn in, will be person who will be deeply involved in that. I would say one other thing, however. If a ship costs twice as much, but it's 3 times as capable, then one has to say, what have we got? Well, we've got something that is more valuable at a higher cost, but on a cost-benefit basis, it's improved as opposed to deteriorated. A smart bomb may cost, what a precision bomb costs or somewhat less, but you have to drop 10 smart dumb bombs to equal one smart bomb, the lethality of one smart bomb. Now, so apples to apples comparisons, it seems to me, don't quite work necessarily. But we do have that problem, and it's something we're concerned about, and it's something we're addressing. And
Thank you. General Myers, we're all worried about retention throughout the services. What's your feeling about retention as we come through this period we're in now? Do we need additional incentives to retention and enlistment?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we have some pretty good incentives in place, and as I said earlier in response to Senator Inouye's question, retention right now is very good in all the services. If you look at the statistics, you may think the Air Force and the Navy retention is down a little bit, but that's programmed because both of those forces, the Air Force and the Navy, are shrinking, and so they do not want to retain as many people. But for the Army active, the Army Reserve component, for the Marine Corps and the Reserves, retention actually is very, very good. So I guess my quick analysis would be that we've got the incentives about right. I would like to tag on just a little bit more about the reserve component. This is an extremely important part of our military capability, our national security. And so whatever we do, the incentives and so forth, recruiting and retention in that component, we got to do it right, because this is a great way for the military, the volunteer military, to connect to America. If you look at a map of America and you look at all the Guard and Reserve locations, some of them pretty small, admittedly, it's a great way to connect to the American people, to the employers out there, to family and friends, and I think it's extremely important. And I wanted to mention that, Senator Inouye. This is not a capability, while it's being used pretty hard in terms of personnel tempo and operational tempo, that we ought to fritter away. We ought to take very good care of it. In our retention money, I think, and this is in the FY06 budget, we've got almost $1 billion in retention items for selective reenlistment bonuses and reserve component health care, educational benefits, enlisted supervisor retention pay, critical pay for our special operators who are in big demand now by contractors in Iraq or Afghanistan or other places in the world, tuition assistance, almost $900 million, but almost $1 billion in retention numbers there that will help. I was in Kabul about 6 or 7 weeks ago, and I got to reenlist, I think, at one time 29 people out of a Army National Guard unit from Indiana, and it was first a great privilege, but and that was the day I was there. I think the week before they reenlisted something like 200. So once we can get them in the door, we're keeping them because they are fulfilled by the mission that they're performing.
Senator Cochran, do you have any further questions?
No further questions.
Senator Byrd, do you have any further questions?
Thank you, yes. Thank you.
Thanks, sir.
In January of this year, members of the 201st Field Artillery Battalion of the West Virginia National Guard contacted me from Iraq with a serious pay problem. Last year, the General Accounting Office reported that members of the 19th Special Forces Group of the West Virginia National Guard came under enemy fire during a trip from Afghanistan to Qatar to fix the rampant pay problems in that unit. Secretary Rumsfeld, I understand that the accounting system used to process pay for reservists in other military services do not have the same problems as those for the National Guard. Why do these problems persist with the National Guard, and when will they be fixed? Why can't the Department of Defense get rid of the accounting systems that don't work for the National Guard and simply adopt the computer systems that pay other troops fairly and accurately?
that's exactly the question I ask in the department frequently. As you know as well as I do, Senator, the services have their own systems in large measure, and the Guard and Reserve systems have tended to be different from the active duty systems. And it was a result of the departments growing up as separate entities. And their policies were different, and their approaches were different, and their systems were different. Some of them used a shoebox with 3x5 cards. Some used a shoebox with 5x7 cards, I guess. And the net result was that you have problems. Now, we're testing and deploying a forward-compatible pay, modern integrated pay system, I'm told. The end state should be a fully integrated pay and personnel system for the Department of Defense. And I don't know when that end point is, Tina, do you?
We are beginning to deploy that system within the next month. We have some testing issues with it, but we're beginning to deploy that. Also, the DIMERS program, which I'm sure you're aware of, Senator, is another key program which will be coming online in 2006.
Well, does Congress need to step in with legislation to fix this problem? How long do you think it'll take for the Pentagon to address these pay problems once and for all?
Sir, the Congress has been extremely helpful with respect to the funding. The DIMERS program in particular has been a great interest to us, and the Congress has been very generous in that regard. We appreciate your help on that, sir.
Last week, the Dallas Morning News carried an article about the need for special bulletproof shorts to protect the legs of troops while traveling in vehicles in Iraq. Although Congress has provided additional funds for bulletproof vests for all troops in combat zones, the large number of roadside bombs in Iraq are known to cause deadly injuries to the legs of soldiers. The article reports that the Marines have developed a low-cost set of bulletproof leggings, but the Army, which has the bulk of the troops in Iraq, is insisting on buying its own version of this protective gear, which costs $9,400 a set, requires special air conditioning technology, and weighs 38 pounds. Secretary Rumsfeld, we now know that our troops did not have enough bulletproof vests to protect them in the early stages of the occupation of Iraq. What are we doing to accelerate the schedule to get this type of protective equipment out to our troops?
Senator Byrd, the department, we've got some charts here. I don't know if we want to bother to put them up, but the department has looked at the requests from the combatant commanders as to what they believed were needed by way of capabilities and equipment. The job of the combatant commander is to look at what he has, ask for what he needs, but in the meantime, adapt tactics, techniques, and procedures so that he can protect his troops. He has the obligation of seeing that they can perform their mission and simultaneously that they're managed and deployed and used in a way that's respectful of the value that they are to our society. And that's what they're doing. And they have had an up ramp, for example, in up-armored Humvees. They've had an, which is that one? Protective, that's the chart on the inserts. Let's see here, I don't know where, there it is. And as you can see, it's gone from December of '02, where the production rates were down, maybe 50,000, 40,000, up to the production rates at very high levels, up in the high 400,000s. So they've responded very rapidly and very successfully, but the important thing is, for the lives of the troops, is that between the time that they need something and the time they get it, and that changes because the enemy has a brain. The enemy, if, for example, with respect to explosive devices, they may use one frequency and you get a jammer that'll stop that, and they'll change frequencies, and they'll use a different technique. They'll use a telephone technique or a garage door opener or something. So you have to keep adapting continuously, and that shows the rate at which the adaptation took place, which is quite impressive.
Well, are there additional funds included in the supplemental appropriation bills or your regular appropriations request to provide for new types of bulletproof armor to protect our troops in Iraq? If so, how many sets of bulletproof leggings or similar equipment will be provided to our troops, and when will they receive this equipment?
Senator Byrd, the answer to your question is yes, there is funding. There is an effort ongoing in the armed services to continually improve the garments they wear. And a couple of the improvements are to make them better against a more serious threat, and that's, I don't want to get into classified here, but a more serious threat, and also to make them lighter, because obviously the troops, in most cases, have to move around in this gear as well. So that's ongoing. There is money in both budgets to help do that. They are fielding advanced sets as the technology becomes available for the current vests. We see some inserts. There's some new inserts being developed that are being fielded as we speak. And they're producing tens of thousands of these to go into theater. But this is a continuing process, and in both budgets there's adequate money for this effort. On the leggings, I have not heard that. I will personally look into that issue. I hadn't heard that before. I'll go look at it.
Thank you. I think that chart is about bulletproof vests.
Senator,
It's about the,
Senator Shelby's here. Could we go to him? We'll come back to you again, sir.
I just have one more
Yes, sir.
question. You'll
Yes,
be
sir.
through with me. What specifically needs to be done to protect the legs of our troops from roadside bombs?
Well, I'll start, and Dick can pick it up. It seems to me the first and most important thing is what's being done, and that is to the extent possible, not have vehicles out operating without appropriate armor in areas outside of protected compounds. So the first thing would be if you had too little armor to protect those vehicles, you wouldn't use those vehicles outside of a compound. You'd find different ways to do it. You'd use airlift, or you'd have different supply centers, or you'd use contractors. And there are a variety of things that people can do to change their tactics and their techniques and their approaches. As the armor is available today, we now have a situation where I do not believe there only occasionally would there be a U.S. vehicle with U.S. military people in it outside of a protected compound that didn't have an appropriate level of armor. Now, the problem with armor, what does it mean, appropriate level? We've seen M1 tanks that have been totally destroyed. Some armor is not necessarily going to protect somebody. And if you have a protective insert and body armor, and then you get an armor-piercing shell, for example, it's going to go through it. There is no protection that is perfect and 100% all the time, every place, and that's just the reality of it.
That's a given. We all understand
Right.
that.
and
Thank you. Thank you.
I would just like to go back to the point, because you asked the question, what can we do? The part that plays the biggest role here, besides the vehicles and the personal protection, it's the tactics that the NCOs and the officers devise, and their reaction to the enemy as they change their tactics. And so technology can help. You can do things with body armor, with armored vehicles, but in the end, the biggest thing we can do is make sure we have smart, well-trained, educated, informed, good intelligence troops out there that can address this threat. You asked the question blank here a little bit. Since the beginning of fiscal year 2004, we spent $5.5 billion on force protection efforts, and we plan on spending another $3.3 billion in fiscal year 05. Interestingly enough, in the supplemental, there's $2.7 billion in force protection efforts, which is just another reason we need to get the supplemental as soon as possible. That money won't get spent until we get it.
Mr. Chairman, I hope we'll be sure that we provide enough money for this, and I hope that we'll take every step possible to see that this equipment is provided as soon as possible.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Shelby is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Rumsfeld and General Myers, welcome again. Everybody's welcome you, but we appreciate what you're doing, the challenge you have, and we're here to do what we can to help you in that regard. The Joint Common Missile, if I could get into that just a minute. The Joint Common Missile was proposed for termination in Presidential Budget Decision 753. 8 months, Mr. Secretary, into phase 1 of system design and development. The Joint Common Missile is remarkably healthy, low risk program, on schedule, on budget. Think of that, on budget, and successfully demonstrating important new capabilities for the warfighter.
Canceling the Joint Common Missile, I believe, ignores the opinion of our top military leaders and deprives our service members of a new capability, Mr. Secretary, that they believe they need to survive against future threats. Further, the Joint Common Missile meets joint service requirements and fills a critical capabilities gap that cannot be met by upgrading existing weapon systems. An example, the Joint Common Missile, and I know you both know this, has twice the standoff range of the Hellfire, Longbow, and Maverick missiles. It will replace on Army, Navy, Marines, on aircraft. The accuracy of its tri-mode seeker would give our forces precision strike lethality to eliminate threats that are located near non-combatants. That's why the top-ranking officers in all three services that have requested the Joint Common Missile, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, all believe the program must be restored. What's the justification, other than trying to save some short-term money, for proposing eliminating this? I think it's a mistake. I think a lot of people think it would be a big mistake.
Senator Shelby, the reason that our advice to the Secretary was to cancel this particular program was that it had been in development for a long period of time, and they actually have a very ambitious goal, as you know, of a seeker that has, I think, three different technologies in it, it's a tri-mode, three modes of acquiring the target, and designing that seeker was certainly high technical risk. And with the inventory of Hellfires and Maverick missiles, over 35,000, we have other ways of doing the job. And so it was thought, this program, let's terminate this program, and the requirement does not go away. The requirement recycles back down to our capabilities requirements system, and we'll look at the requirement and maybe back off some of the features we want in this missile, but it was technically having some difficulties, and that's why we joined in.
Well, we've been told recently that they've been jumping over all the barriers, that everything was working well. It was, as I said, under budget, and the program was moving very fast. This is in the last few days.
The information we had back in December when these decisions were made is that there was cost growth, schedule creep, and high technical risk in the seeker, and that's why it was, and I have not reviewed it here.
Yeah, we would like to further talk with you and the Secretary, a lot of us, about this, because not just myself, but a lot of us believe that it would be a big, big mistake to cancel this very promising, very on budget and on time Joint Common Missile. So we'll get back with both of you on this, and
yes, sir.
That will ultimately be a decision of the committee anyway. Mr. Chairman, that's all I have today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Noe.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a statement I'd like to make. Mr. Secretary, as part of your global posture review, you'll be repositioning forces around the world. In the Asia-Pacific region, you'll be moving forces out of Korea and possibly moving some Marines out of Okinawa. As you know, our Asian neighbors, both friends and potential adversaries, are very sensitive to changes in the U.S. military posture and management structures which govern these forces. In that light, I was disturbed to learn that the Navy is contemplating changes to its management structure for the Pacific Fleet, separate from your global posture review. Considering all other changes that are underway in the region, I would hope that you would not support any changes to the operational or administrative control or other management functions of the Pacific Fleet.
Mr. Secretary, that's a request, but I would state this, that Senator Noe and I have made a practice of traveling the Pacific now for over 30 years. We have, every time we go to a foreign country, we ask the same question, and a new generation of people involved in the operation. We literally have been doing this now for more than 30 years. And we asked them, what do you think about the presence of the United States in the Pacific? Do you think we should reduce it or should increase it? I think I cannot remember one single country, including China, who ever said anything to us about reducing the forces of the Pacific. We are the stabilizing force of the Pacific. So I emphasize his statement. Let me ask you one last question. I did promise we'd be out of here by 12:30. Will the QDR be completed in time for the President to take it into account in terms of the 07 budget request?
The QDR, of course, is an activity that's made up of many parts, and the answer is that there's no question but that we will be informed as we go through the QDR process this year in ways that will in fact affect the fiscal year 07 budget. There may very well be pieces of it that we would assign for further study and that would not be at a stage of completion that would enable us to be informed by the outcomes for the 07, in which case they'd very likely affect an 08 or later. But a lot of it will be.
Well, again, I think we can remember times when the QDR came to us at a time we already had the President's request, and it certainly confused the subject of defense before this subcommittee. So whatever we can do to get the information that pertains to the appropriations request before the 07 budget's received, I think will be very helpful here, very helpful.
We will certainly try to do that. You're quite right. It is a distraction to send up a budget and then be asked by Congress to do a quadrennial defense review simultaneously and begin that process and have it reveal things that lead you to a different conclusion. And I can well understand the layering effect and the distraction it causes, and we'll try to do our best.
Thank you. Well, again, gentlemen, and Ms. Jones, we thank you very much for your testimony. I want to make this statement to you. I've made it to you privately, and others may not agree with me, but I've been privileged to be at meetings, Ms. Secretary, that you've had with the Joint Chiefs. I've never seen such a relationship between the Chiefs and the Secretary, open discussion, open critique, and really a give and take that was very, very, really, I think, very helpful and very healthy as far as the Department is concerned. You obviously, Mr. Secretary, had a previous iteration as Secretary, so there's never been a Secretary that had more background than you have. But I'll say this to General Myers. I have been a devotee of General Eisenhower since World War II and had the privilege of serving under him. As I've told you personally, and I'd like to say publicly now, you come as close to Ike as any general I've ever known. Nice. So we thank you very much for your service, and we will look forward to being with you whatever you do. Thank you very much. Our next committee meeting will be a closed session this afternoon at 2:30 to discuss classified programs in this 2006 budget. Our next open session will be Tuesday, May 10th at 10 a.m. when we'll receive testimony on the defense medical programs. The subcommittee stands in recess. We thank you all for your attendance.
Ed, may we submit questions for the record?
There will be questions submitted for the record, Mr. Secretary. I failed to notify that, but that's common practice. Thank you.